together. Our gracious Father, again we are thankful for your love, for your grace, and we ask that we would behold Jesus, that we would be filled with His Spirit, that we would be able to share His love, His grace with others, that they would see Jesus in us is our prayer in His name. Amen. Cloud nine, simple little term. What comes to mind when you hear that? I'm guessing it might make a little difference depending on how old you are or how young you are. Have you heard it? I'm guessing there's probably even maybe some of the younger, but most everybody, you've heard that term, right? You're familiar with it. Maybe you've even experienced it. Use that expression or know someone who has felt that emotion, that experience. What does it mean? Well, of course, I suppose you could find different meanings, and I don't know that the internet is the most reliable source to give you definitions and explanations, but it is interesting that it says the phrase on cloud nine, meaning that one is blissfully happy, started life in the United States and has been widely known since the 1950s. Kind of going back to maybe some of us when, we would be more familiar with that term and maybe a little less familiar. Interesting, reading some of the history, it talked about, in Buddhism, there are 10 levels. The 9th, getting to the point where everything you do is totally unselfish. And that'd be kind of nice. While I don't believe in the teachings, there is something too that's where we're supposed to be moving to. But the problem is how we get there. The only way that I will become totally unselfish is by the grace of God in my life. But that's the 9th step. And then the 10th is, of course, nirvana, where you reach that, ultimate experience. There is only one way that we will experience that. That is by the grace of God. But we use the expression, the experience. I'd probably say that being at Game 7 in 2001 was pretty close to that experience. You remember that line drive Luis Gonzalez hit? It just made it to the outfield. I can remember for a long time afterwards, and even now a little bit when you hear that call on the radio, it just had a feeling that came over you. There was something special. Well, at least for those of us that were Diamondback fans. I talked to my friend Ed, and he doesn't share the same feeling. It was kind of a nightmare to him for some reason. Maybe it was because I tried to tell him he was pulling for the wrong team, but different things. Probably some of us could relate closer to home here, an NFC championship game. Unfortunately, the following wasn't quite as exciting for those that were Cardinal fans. But to get there, that feeling, maybe, it's meeting someone famous. I still remember getting on a plane, I've mentioned it before, but when I was going to Peru in the flight from Phoenix to Dallas, and going, I had learned, if you pick that exit row seat, you have a little more space. Not that I'm real big, but I still like a little more space. But there was this really large gentleman that, kind of stood up. He was in the aisle seat. I had the window, and he stood up so I could get in. And as we sat down, he said, my name is Rayfield Wright. I used to play for the Dallas Cowboys. Now, some of you may not know that I like the Cowboys. And all of a sudden here, you're sitting for 2 hours next to a Hall of Fame Dallas Cowboy player. It was exciting. Maybe, you're the romantic, that first date. You remember that experience. It was so exciting. Now, of course, maybe the second or there wasn't, we better not go there. But I do remember my friend Roger. And this was actually prior to the first date. It was a young lady that he was taking flight lessons, and she was working at the counter. And as, he was there, he winked at her. Well, the story goes on from there. She went home from Birmingham to Meridian, about 150 miles, drove home to tell her mother that this guy winked at her. I think I would have picked up the phone, but she chose to drive home. Her mother said, well, why don't you ask him out? Now, I don't know if it's 26 or 27 years they've been married. I don't know that they would say that it was all cloud nine experience. There may have been some other kind of clouds that came in, but they've stayed together. It's been a good marriage. Maybe it's that day when that person proposed. Maybe it's a wedding day. Maybe it's the birth of a child. A lot of things that are positive, but sadly there are probably some negatives. You know, I hate to put the concept of drugs, but there are people that try to achieve that kind of feeling, that kind of emotional bliss, whatever it is, you know, if I just take the right thing, I can somehow manufacture it. I won't ask for a show of hands, but there may be some that understand that bath salts are called cloud nine. They're inhaled. There's other names for it too, to get a high. There's, of course, a danger to it. I remember volunteering at the Salvation Army and being part of a support group for people that were dealing with addictions. And I remember one of the guys sharing his experience that twice he was revived. And he said, my first thoughts when I regained consciousness was not thank you for saving my life, but you ruined my high. How sad it is, the effect that it can have. But the desire to have this emotional state, and the devil gives us all sorts of, you know, if you just try this or this or this, it will work. It will give you what you're looking for. Ironically, the one person who knows what we're looking for, who was there in heaven, who experienced that and chose to leave it. And he tries to tell us there's some way you can achieve it other than the one way that works, and that is a relationship with Jesus. Spiritually. Accepting Jesus. Does that bring that experience, that emotion, that bliss? Maybe it's experiencing His forgiveness, understanding that in spite of the fact that I do not deserve it, I can never be worthy of it, God has chosen to forgive me because He loves me and He knows that is the only way to restore my relationship with Him. Maybe it's baptism. That time when you make a public expression of your faith in Jesus, your acceptance of His death, being buried with Him in baptism, and being raised to new life in Him. Maybe it's an experience that you need. If you haven't been baptized, I encourage you to think about it. Talk to the pastor, talk to one of the elders, talk to your family, talk to somebody, make those arrangements. Maybe it's some special song that you know that just seems to touch your heart in a way that nothing else does. Forgive me, but I'd like to think maybe even there might be an occasional sermon. Not because of the preacher, but because of the Spirit that touches your heart. Maybe it's a week of prayer, a revival, a prophecy seminar, whatever it may be, something that has uplifted your heart and your soul. Maybe it's spending time alone with Jesus. Do you take the time to spend with Him, to cultivate your relationship with Him? The disciples, there on the mountain, they see Jesus glorified. They see Moses and Elijah. I wonder how it affected them. I wonder how it would have affected you. It would have affected me if we would have been there. You remember the story. Matthew 17, starting with verse 1. Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And He was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and His clothes became white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with Him. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. But Jesus came and touched them and said, "Arise, and do not be afraid." And when they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. Now, I don't want to oversimplify things, but if you really want to experience happiness, peace, contentment, it is when you come to the point where you see nothing but Jesus only. When your focus is on Him, and there is nothing Satan or the world or anything else can do to take our eyes off of Jesus. There is peace that comes in beholding Him. But on the top of the mountain, I can't help but think a little bit what they were thinking. Would they have liked to stay? Would they have wanted to stay up there? We're not given details as to why Peter said, let's build 3 tabernacles, 3 temples, but it would kind of imply some permanence. We'll kind of stay up here with Jesus and Moses and Elijah. Let's see how much trouble the scribes and the priests and the rulers will give while we're up here with Moses and Elijah. They won't bother Jesus. I don't know what Peter was thinking, but I can imagine it's a place you would want to stay. You wouldn't want to leave. I don't think the disciples wanted to go back down the mountain. Now, we're not told if this was something Jesus wanted to do, but I imagine there was a part of Him that would have enjoyed staying up there as well. But that wasn't His purpose. That wasn't His mission. The top of the mountain. To be on cloud 9, so to speak. To have that experience. If you've ever had it, did it last? Can it last? Even in a spiritual context, do we ever stay on those spiritual, emotional highs? The reality is we don't. There's a time where we come off the mountain and we come to the valley, and sometimes we come there and it's not very pretty. It's not very nice. Will it last? Is there a time coming when that will last forever, where we will stay on the mountain? The Bible talks about it. Talks about a new heaven and a new earth. Revelation 21, verses 4 and 5. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Then He who sat on the throne said, Behold, I make what? All things new. And He said, Write, for these words are true and faithful. There is a true and faithful witness that is promised. There is a day coming when God will create a new heaven and a new earth. And we will be on a spiritual high that will never dip down, that we will never come off of. But sadly, for the moment, we still live in this world of sin and sorrow and pain and suffering. But there is coming a day when God will wipe away the tears and they will never come back. There will be no more sorrow, no more suffering. But until that day, we have to live with this world. Jesus tells us about it. John 16, verses 32 and 33. Indeed, the hour is coming, yes, has now come, that you will be scattered, each on his own, and you will leave me alone, yet I am not alone. Why? Because the Father is with me. Even though all of Jesus' disciples, His friends, His followers abandon Him, Jesus says, I am not alone. All of your friends may abandon you. They may turn on you. But as long as you are with God, you will never be alone. Jesus goes on, these things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have what? Peace. In the world you will have, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Sometimes you hear these preachers that stand up and they say, if you just accept Jesus, if you follow, everything will go well. You'll have a wonderful life. And there's some truth to that. It is a wonderful life being a Christian. But a wonderful life does not mean a life free from problems and tribulation. It means that I have a peace that no matter what is going on around me, no matter what the devil is trying to do to me or in me or with me, he cannot take away my peace, because my peace is based on Jesus. These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have what? Overcome the world. My friends, my peace, your peace is based on what Jesus has done and what He has promised. And that Satan cannot take away. He cannot go back and backtrack and change what happened at the cross of Calvary. There is peace that I can have. Do we need to be on the top of the mountain? Did Jesus need it? Do we need it? Is it something that we take time for, to try to go up on the mountain and spend quality time with God? Do you take time to be alone with God? Take time to study. Take time to pray. Do you take time to hear that still small voice when Jesus speaks to us, when He wants through His Spirit to touch our hearts and to touch our lives? Or is there so much chaos in your life that you can't hear that small voice? Maybe you need to find your mountaintop. It may not literally be a mountaintop, but it's somewhere where you can go and you can be alone with God. You can spend quality time with Him. Luke puts it simply, and it's other places as well. Now it came to pass in those days that He, Jesus, went out to the mountain and prayed and continued all night in prayer. If Jesus needs quality time alone with the Father, how much more do you and I need to spend time alone with Jesus? Jesus needed time alone with God, with His Father. Time to recharge, time to renew, time to prepare for the ministry that God had sent Him to do. Time to prepare for those times in the valley when things are not exactly what we wish they were. May I put it simply, we need time on the mountain so that we can serve in the valley. The purpose of going up on the mountain is to be recharged, to be renewed, to find focus, to find strength in our relationship so that I can come down off the mountain and I can minister, I can share what God has done. Matthew chapter 17, verse 9, as they're coming down. Now as they came down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. There's that theme He keeps repeating over, this idea of dying and rising again. Interesting, the disciples don't seem to get that. And the disciples ask Him, saying, why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Now again, folks, I can't speak for the disciples, but I can certainly ask the question, if Jesus just said coming down from the mountain that He's going to die and rise again, where does the thought about Elijah come into this picture? You know, let's go back for just, here's what, and as they came down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. Now, what would your question be? How many of you would ask about Elijah? I don't understand. But you know, I wonder. Maybe the reason is really very simple, and maybe we understand more than we want to. Because, you know, a lot of times when somebody brings up a subject that we really don't feel comfortable talking about, what do? We change it. Well, you know, what about so-and-so? What about... You know, I believe that Jesus was longing for them to say, can you explain this? We don't understand. It doesn't make sense that you're talking about dying. That's not how we understand it. Could you explain it? But they really didn't want to see. They really didn't want to understand. And so they asked the question, why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And it's interesting, Jesus doesn't rebuke them. He goes with that. Jesus answered and said, indeed, Elijah is coming first and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah has come already, and they did not know him, but did to him whatever they wished. Likewise, the Son of Man is also about to suffer at their hands. Again, Jesus is trying to point out what's going to, just like Elijah in the person of John the Baptist suffered, so Jesus is going to. Just like they weren't ready to accept the message of Elijah, they're not ready to accept the message of the one who sent Elijah in the first place. Then the disciples understood that he spoke to them of John the Baptist. Interesting, though, they didn't understand the part about him going and suffering and dying. Coming down from the mountain. Why did Jesus come down? Why did he come down from the mountain? Why did he come down from heaven? It's really very simple. He came to seek and to save the lost. He came to find lost people and save them. He came to free us from the power of sin and Satan, that we might truly be free. You know, how many people, I'm free? No, you've just bought into a different lie. You're not really free unless you have given your life to Jesus. There is no freedom. There's a pseudo, the devil will convince you you're free. Well, I do my own thing. I don't listen to you. I just do what I want to do. No, you don't. The devil's convinced you of that lie, that you're just following your own desires, but you're following his. There is no freedom apart from Jesus coming down from the mountain. What is waiting for Jesus? There is conflict. There is a demon-possessed boy down there that the disciples were asked to cure and they couldn't do it. That's what's immediately waiting. But just shortly down, as Jesus has talked about, there is Calvary. That is what's waiting for Jesus when he comes down the mountain. Let me remind you, when you come off the mountain, there is still a cross for you to take up and for you to carry. Sometimes, it's easy to understand why we want to stay on the mountain instead of coming down to the valley and taking up our cross. Satan is trying to destroy, but Jesus came to restore. The coming of Elijah. The disciples asked about it. Jesus talked about it. Let me ask you, what was Elijah's mission? What was the mission of John the Baptist? And maybe equally relevant, what is our mission? For you and for me. Malachi chapter 4, the last 3 verses of the Old Testament. It's interesting how the Old Testament ends with a promise and talking about 2 people, ironically, that we find up on the mountaintop. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel with all the statutes and judgments. First is Moses, and then comes Elijah. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming and the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Maybe we're getting a glimpse as to why the disciples ask about Elijah. Because you see, they wanted the great and dreadful day of the Lord. They didn't want the day when the Lord was going to die. But I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I should come and strike the earth with a curse. What is the work of Elijah? It is to come and to restore broken relationships, to turn families that are against each other, to unite them. I wonder, do we need that today? Do you know any broken homes, any broken families? Are you a part of Luke? Talking about the work of John the Baptist. Chapter 1, verse 16. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. He will also go before him in the spirit and the power of Elijah to turn what? The hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready what? A people prepared for the Lord. I wonder, do we need Elijah today? Do we need people who are committed to preparing for the coming of the Lord and helping others to be prepared for that day, helping people to be ready when Jesus comes? Matthew 17, verse 11, Jesus answered and said to them, indeed, Elijah is coming first and will what? Restore all things. The mission of Elijah, the mission of John the Baptist, the mission of the disciples, the mission of us today, the mission of Jesus is all the same. It is to restore. It is to restore broken relationships. It's about restoring broken families, broken homes. It's about restoring broken lives, maybe even some that don't even realize they're broken. Because sadly, the devil has done such a good job of selling brokenness as the norm that some of us don't even know we're broken and we need to be fixed. We could talk about Revelation, that last church, that Laodicean church that thinks what? I'm rich and in need of nothing. They don't realize they are broken, they are destitute, they have nothing. Do we need the mission of Elijah today? The mission, your purpose. Is it possible that you have forgotten? Is it possible that maybe you need a reminder, something to kind of light a fire under you, so to speak? Do you need to know how to fulfill it? Do you need strength? Do you need God's Spirit, God's grace in your life to help you fulfill the mission that He has called you to do? Are you spending time with Jesus on a regular basis? And I don't mean to offend anyone, but 5 minutes in the morning when you get up probably is not enough. I'm all for reading devotional books, but if that is the extent of your devotions, it's probably not going to be enough. It may take more than 5 minutes a day. If Jesus spent hours, nights in prayer with God, how is it that we think we're going to get by on 5 minutes a day? And then we wonder why my spiritual life didn't go well. Why isn't God working in my life? I prayed and I asked Him to do some things. And then I forgot about Him the rest of the day. And I don't know why He hadn't spoken to me. Maybe He has. Maybe He wants to speak to you, but you've got so much chaos going on in your life that you can't hear. Are you spending time with Jesus? You see, my friends, I must take time to climb the mountain. Sometimes I need to climb it alone and spend time by myself with Jesus. Sometimes I need, like Jesus, to take 2 or 3 friends with me and spend time in prayer. Spend time together. The Bible talks about when 2 or 3 are gathered in His name, we need to pray on our own, but we need to pray with others. We need to climb the mountain. We need to be restored. We need to be renewed. We need to see Jesus in His glory. But it's not so we can bask in it and stay there. It is so that we can come back down the mountain, so that we can share what Jesus has done with others. Have you been to the mountain? Did you see Jesus? Did you behold His glory? Have you come down to share His love, to share His grace, to share the fact that He died just as He said, and on the 3rd day He rose again, and He has offered that everlasting life to each and every one of us if we are willing to choose to accept it. Are you willing to accept His gift? Yes, He wants you to come and meet Him on the mountain. But just as Jesus did not stay on the mountain, when you meet Him, He's going to take you down in the valley to serve. And when you come down in the valley, there's some things that aren't so pleasant. But whatever it is you face when you come down into the valley, if you face it with Jesus, it's not really a challenge. There is no contest. Just as when Jesus gets down and there is that demon-possessed boy, it is no contest. It was for the disciples, but not for Jesus. I like a statement. The book Desire of Ages. Jesus did not count heaven a place to be desired. while we were lost. He left the heavenly courts for a life of reproach and insult and a death of shame. He who was rich in heaven's priceless treasures became poor, that through his poverty we might be rich. We are to follow in the path he trod. Love for souls for whom Christ died means crucifixion of self. He who is a child of God should henceforth look upon himself as a link in the chain let down to save the world, one with Christ in His plan of mercy, going forth with Him to seek and to save the lost. The Christian is ever to realize that he has consecrated himself to God and that in character he is to reveal Christ to the world. The self-sacrifice, the sympathy, the love manifested in the life of Christ are to reappear in the life of the worker for God. I wonder, I really don't wonder, I say it, if that happened in our lives as a church, what would happen in our community? What would happen here in Apache Junction? What would happen in Arizona if we truly took that concept seriously? We wouldn't be here very long because we have a mission and we could complete it. Coming down from the mountain, it's not easy. It's not convenient. I don't believe it was easy or convenient for Jesus to come down from heaven, but it is essential if there is to be any hope in our lives. Jesus came down from heaven. He was willing to leave the splendor of heaven for you and for me, to reveal to us the truth about God, to restore our broken relationship with God and with others. Do you need to be restored? Are you broken? Are you hurting in your life? Have you lost hope? Are you looking for hope in all the wrong places? You know that if I try this or I try this, and the devil has that list and he can keep you going forever. As long as life lasts, trying everything that won't work. Are you willing to try Jesus? Are you willing to accept Jesus? Are you willing to give your life to Him? You see, folks, I want to be on cloud 9. I want to be on cloud 9 for eternity. I want to see Jesus coming in the clouds of glory like the Apostle Paul talks about. For the Lord Himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with a trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. And then what happens? And then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them where? In the clouds. My friend, Jesus intends for us to live in the clouds for eternity with Him. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus shall we always be what? With the Lord. There was nothing the disciples longed for more after Jesus went to heaven than to be with the Lord. And when there is nothing we desire more than to be with the Lord, we won't be here very long. We'll be with Him. But as long as there are things that we are satisfied with and we are content with other than being with Jesus, we won't be with Jesus. And if He does come, we won't be too excited or happy about it. I wonder, is it your hope to be with Jesus forever? Do you want, like Elijah, to be caught up in the clouds? It may be a chariot of clouds. It may be a cloud of angels. I don't care what the cloud's made of. If Jesus is there, that's where I want to be. I want to be in that cloud. I don't care if I live to see it or if I'm resurrected. It doesn't matter as long as I'm in that cloud with Jesus. But there is only one way. I must accept Jesus. I must invite Him into my heart. I must go with Him to Calvary. I must be crucified with Christ so that it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. My friends, I've got to tell you that in order to live in the clouds, you've got to be crucified. You got to go to the cross of Calvary. But the good news is that tomb that could not hold Jesus cannot hold any of us. If we are crucified with Christ, we will live forever with Him. Would you like to accept Jesus' gift right now? To accept that life, that hope that He wants to give you? Are you willing to give your life to Him? Would you like to have the hope of seeing Jesus coming in the clouds of glory to take you home? To know that when Jesus comes, you won't be crying for the rocks and the mountains. You will be shouting for joy, this is our God who has come to save us. Is it your desire to have that hope in your heart? If that is your desire with me, then I invite you to stand as we sing our hymn of dedication. We have this hope.